persons were injured. In the DPR, 5 persons were killed. At least 51 persons were injured. On June 22nd, the drone attacked the passenger bus in Gorlovka. 18 persons were injured. There are children among victims, 2 boys born in 2014 and 2019, as well as a teen born in 2008. June 24th, as the result of the Ukrainian attack in Gorlovka, 3 persons were killed. Zaporozhye region, 5 persons were killed. 8 were injured, including 2-year-old and 5-year-old girls. Kursk region, 2 persons were killed, and at least 5 persons were injured as a result of the attacks. In the LPR, 2 persons killed and 2 persons injured. Zhigorodsky region, on June 24th, overnight, 2 persons injured and 2 persons killed. Crimea, June 21st, the attack on the Kerch Peninsula, on the ferry line also 4 persons killed and 28 persons injured. Kherson region, 5 persons killed, 30 persons injured, including a child born in 2020. I would like to say that I would like to add more information about human rights track that is quite important for the West. On June 10th, Brussels hosted the 11th EU-Ukraine Human Rights Dialogue. You won't believe that it was organized. Well, what does it have to do with human rights? Because none of the facts that we are providing every briefing, I'm talking about the figures and names of victims and about how Ukrainian Kiev regime is killing civilians. Nothing was mentioned at that dialogue. If anyone expected that EU officials who claim to be main humanists and champions of democracy and human rights will strongly criticize Kiev for massive and systematic human rights violations, then this person would make a horrible mistake. And we're talking about Ukraine as well as the territories that are no longer Ukrainian. Zelensky's regime wasn't reprimanded for anything in terms of the total discrimination against ethnic Russian and Russian-speaking citizens, crackdown on canonical orthodoxy, corruption, infringement on freedom of speech, forced mobilization, political persecutions, and killings of persons that Zelensky describes as their own people, Ukrainians, people who are living in regions. He calls them as their own citizens. Then why EU officials didn't ask him a question? If you call these people your citizens, why are you relentlessly killing them? In the context of human rights that were discussed with Ukraine, they could have asked that question, but they didn't do that. EU must have known about rampant lawlessness in Ukraine. A number of international human rights monitoring mechanisms, including the UN Human Rights Monitoring Mission in Ukraine, United Nations Human Rights Treaty Body, special procedures of the United Nations Human Rights Council, which can be hardly qualified as pro-Russian, but yet they have moderately and repeatedly indicated that there are serious violations by the Kiev regime of its international commitments to protect human rights of national and linguistic minorities as well as religious ones. However, Brussels chose to turn a blind eye to, and he has transformed the dialogue on human rights into the platform where Russophobic statements are made and approaches are coordinated to promote the anti-Russian line. But it's no surprise to us. Brussels is discussing human rights with Ukraine, but yet it doesn't see any human rights violations. But at the same time, it provides more money and weapons to the Kiev regime. which is used against civilians of various origin, religion, and age. They don't see any link between these two situations. These human rights have nothing to do with the reality, probably human rights created by artificial intelligence, but yet they prefer to ignore the human rights of a real person who work, study, go to school. Participants of this gathering should feel equal. Who is teacher, who is a student? It's rather a rhetorical question, but the EU is pursuing a policy to suppress any form of dissent. It tightens control over digital information field, public political discourse, as well as the will of citizens. They have various know-hows, electoral and political technologies, to the point of the annulment of election results if wrong candidates win. All of these methods were tested out, and they're actively exported to all the countries that are in the area of EU's interests. In this context, the praise for Vladimir Zelensky for his efforts to align Ukrainian electoral standards with EU standards and making commitments together with Brussels to ensure the highest level of respect, protection, and fulfillment of human rights sound as a mockery of the relevant international platforms. EU and Ukraine use all these methods to promote their inferior anti-Russian approaches by insulting millions of Russian-speaking Ukrainians who are not allowed to speak Russian or to use Russian as the language of instruction. They insult thousands of political prisoners who are locked in Ukrainian prisons only for refusing to hate Russians, and they insult parishioners of the canonical Ukrainian Orthodox Church who are being expelled by force. Well, they haven't seen all of that. Yesterday, on June 24th, the accomplices of the Kiev junta have taken over the church of the Reverend Alexander Nevsky. The clergy and parishioners were injured as the result of the attack. It's yet another gross act of arbitrariness against the canonical Ukrainian Orthodox Church. Well, today is June 25th. Probably Brussels has spoken about it something. Well, they have said nothing. To contain Russia, Brussels is ready to turn a blind eye to the revival of Nazism, manifestations of extreme forms of racism, Russophobia obviously being one of them in EU and its neighboring countries. But they do not notice that. They even encourage those who's responsible for discrimination against Russian nationals and Russian-speaking compatriots. EU qualifies all of that as the so-called European values. But I think that the enlightened European public needs to reflect on the following. The lessons learned from the history of numerous European countries demonstrate that those who allowed the rights of certain populations living nearby to be violated will ultimately end up marginalized.
Nothing also was said about the Kiev regime killing civilians, even children. No, Brussels preferred to turn a blind eye to this at this human rights gathering. But for all those crimes, the Kiev regime will bear and is already bearing responsibility. The Russian law enforcement agency keep connecting data to bring to justice the Kiev regime, militants, commanders for the crimes they have committed. Russia's investigative committee has established the involvement of the commandant of the Ukrainian Armed Forces and Manned Systems Forces, Robert Brovdy, so-called Madya, and the head of the main intelligence directorate of Ukraine, Oleg Ivashenko, in the terrorist attack on the 17th of June on a passenger bus in the Bryansk region carrying children's football team from the Gomel region. They ensured targeting and issued the order to carry out the strike on children. The direct perpetrators have been identified: servicemen of the Unmanned Systems Unit Chimera, the 105th Border Detachment of the State Border Service of Ukraine, Dmitry Tkachenko, a serviceman of the Rapid Response Border Commandant Office Shkval on the 7th Border Detachment, Igor Zhukov, a serviceman of the 73rd Maritime Special Operations Center, Vladislav Naum. Decisions have been issued to charge Brovdi, Vashenko, Tkachenko and Zhukov and Naum under Part 3 of Article 205 of the Criminal Code of the Russian Federation. Commission of a Terrorist Act resulting in the loss of life. All have been placed on the international wanted list. For terrorist activities in the Kursk region in 2025, previously detained Ukrainian armed forces militants Semiluta and Sergei Olenik were each sentenced to 15 years of imprisonment. A sentence of life in prison was handed down in absentia to Ukraine Armed Forces militant Sergei Zhenich, who on 30th of October 2025 carried out a terrorist attack using a UV in the village of Gudovka that resulted in the death of one civilian. Mercenaries who fought on the side of Ukraine, Viktor Eduard Pelens, Brazil, Krosan Kevin Eric, Britain, Mirza Vanadze, Georgia, were each sentenced in absentia to 14 years of imprisonment and are in the international wanted list. Now, speaking about the sponsors of all that and how they do that. On the 18th of June this year, NATO headquarters in Brussels, only a week after Brussels were discussing human rights in Ukraine, only a week later, on the 18th of June, the very same Brussels, under the co-chairmanship of Britain and Germany, the 35th meeting of the so-called contact group on defense assistance to Ukraine took place. The Ramstein format. Pentagon Chief Pete Hegseth did not ask about the destination of the weaponry they allocate to Ukraine, whether it is going occasionally to kill civilians. No, once again, he declined to participate, although it took place almost back-to-back with the NATO defense ministers meeting at which the US defense secretary was present and even delivered a speech. US, Germany, France, Italy, Great Britain and other representatives who on a daily basis keep saying that their main objective refers to liberation, human rights. Why wouldn't they at least once employ and implement all those narratives in practice? In absentia or in presence within this Ramstein format. The contact group focused on the most acute needs of the Ukrainian armed forces for air defense systems and ammunition, including long-range system. The tone was set by the President Zelensky in the hall, and no one asked him about human rights. He boasted of non-existent successes of the Ukrainian army at the front, which, as he claimed, had become possible thanks to Allied assistance. He demanded them to increase these assistance in order to, as he said, achieve peace with Russia on terms favorable to Kiev and the West. He also didn't fail to praise the terrorist drone attacks of the Kiev regime on residential buildings, civilian facilities, schools, kindergartens and hospitals. At the same time, his triumphant reports did not sit well with the pleas for increased arms deliveries to Ukraine. On top of that, Zelensky called for the development of a special mechanism for long-term funding of the Ukrainian armed forces for the period after the end of the conflict, with the aim of, as he put it, turning the Ukrainian army into a pan-NATO shield against the mythical Russian threat. The newly appointed British Defense Secretary Dan Jarvis, I don't know how long he's going to hold this position, he voiced requests for military aid that had been pre-agreed with Kiev. Participants in the Ramstein format are expected to contribute $1 billion to cover two tranches under the NATO initiative Priority Urgent Requirement List for Ukraine Pearl program. $1 billion for the purchase of 200,000 155mm extended range artillery shells, $650 million for the order of 100 Patriot air defense system missiles, and another $1 billion is expected to be spent on financing the production of 1 million Ukrainian drones. Germany plans to make the most substantial contribution, but they seem to have found solution for the domestic problems. They seem not to need to improve the quality of life, their wealth, and peaceful development and welfare of German citizens. So they seem to have found all the solutions. That is why Berlin will allocate $400 million, of which 200 will go toward the purchase of American weapons under the Pearl. Another 200 million will go for American Patriot system missiles. So the German leadership basically takes all which is left from its residents to purchase American weaponry to give it to the Kiev regime, which in its turn uses it against own population. So this is a powerful human rights dossier. This is mighty European values and European solidarity. This is a hideous interpretation of the term of democracy. In addition, Germany intends to transfer several hundred A2AM missiles from Bundeswehr stocks to Ukraine. The government of Friedrich Merz hopes that the other participants of the Ramstein format will follow Germany's example. So far, only a few have responded to this call. Britain promised to produce around 150,000 drones by the end of this year and to deliver more than 350 air defense missiles and radars using funds obtained from, as they put it, frozen, but we would call it seized Russian assets. A sum of £752 million is mentioned. The Netherlands has undertaken to finance the procurement of drones and a defense system to the tune of €500 million, including €250 million under the Pearl. Belgium has confirmed its plans to deliver the first 7 F-17 fighter jets in 2026 out of the promised fleet of 50 aircraft by 2030. Some will be used for spare parts and so-called auxiliary purposes. The announced terms of so-called donations for the continuation of bloody aggression against civilians serves as yet another compelling piece of evidence that today Europe, the West, has become the main obstacle to peace. In the Orwellian perception of Europeans, war is, in a way, a path to peace. That is why they are actively investing in the military reinforcement of the Zelensky regime, positioning themselves as its strategic rear, continuing their attempts to inflict defeat, as they put it, or strategic defeat, or the defeat on the battlefield in our country. But to achieve that, they use civilian lives. Kiev, meanwhile, spreading fables about its imminent victory and seeking to make its allies believe in it, is pursuing a single goal: to provoke us into escalating the conflict, to secure new tranches of Western military and financial aid, which will inevitably be torn apart by those piranha from bank of a street, will be pushed in Western pockets, and ultimately to push NATO and EU countries into a direct military clash with Russia. And you know, the Bandera regime truly demonstrates creativity in a certain sense. In an effort to show the effectiveness of Western military aid, the Zelensky regime has begun publicly boasting about the results of the Ukrainian armed forces' use of sponsor-supplied weapons against Russia, against civilians, accompanied by video footage of terrorist attacks conducted in residential areas and in civil infrastructure. De facto, this is a true safari chase against human living creatures. A premiere screening was timed to coincide with the G7 summit and the Eurostheater International Arms Exhibition held in France last week. However, the organizers did not take into account that in doing so, they and their sponsors are once again confirming the involvement of Kiev's sponsors in the current conflict and their support for the crimes committed by the Ukrainian armed forces. But this is hideous and abominable. Think of this. They show in video footage in real time how Western weaponry attacks civilian infrastructure. I believe this is some kind of horror movies. But you know, usually that is how it goes. But the Kiev regime keeps boasting about that. I do not even know how to call it. They tend to show their audacity in a way, failing to understand that basically they only confirm their inhumane narrative and inhumane policy. By the way, these creators from the Bank of a Street were also noticed in other shows. A video emerged in online about a father who found out that the final battle engaging his son was put online in real time for money. This is some kind of entertainment, and this has become a daily routine. The father of the commander was victim of lies, claiming his son had lost his memory and had been captured, but also demanded money to include him in the exchange list. Such entertainment involving the live killing of mobilized Ukrainian armed forces soldiers on the battlefield was also demanded by the Western masters of today's Ukraine, but for them this is a daily routine, everyday neocolonial practice for them. They are used to staging safaris on people. You remember that was the case in the Donbass, in the Balkans. It was also the case in Afghanistan. It was the case in Vietnam and also in Iraq. All the above-mentioned facts confirm the continued relevance of the objectives of denazification and demilitarization of Ukraine and the elimination of threats emanating from its territory. These objectives and tasks, as the Russian leadership repeated, will be achieved without a fail. Well, now let us move forward to a neighboring region, to Moldova. The official Chisinau keeps going hysterical, blaming Russia in all its failures. Now, the Moldovan leadership showed the Moscow hand in the exponential growth of the cases of phone scams in the Republic. On the 17th of June, the Information and Security Service of Moldova published a comment on an identified, and I quote, operation by the Russian Special Services, unquote, on mass gathering of data on Moldovan citizens by hacking private servers and acquiring personal data in darknet. As usually, no substantiated grounds. They also say that this information has been transferred to organized criminal groups to be used in scams and to steal funds from bank accounts. Apparently, that amid growing social discontent owing to the failures of law enforcement agencies in Moldova to fight against organized crime and rampant phone scams, the authorities come to the only tool in their toolkit, Russophobic sentiment. The absurdity of this accusation only proves the incapacity of Moldovan authorities to handle domestic threats, but also the lack of fantasy at all. And this is their endless attempt to shift the blame. Let me remind here that these phone scams, they know no boundaries. Our country perhaps is one of the targets of the Kiev regime and other criminals who use information technologies and communication technologies, keep calling and sending messages in order to steal funds or to instigate them to commit crimes. Is Chisinau unaware of that, of the fact that our citizens suffer from attacks and the way we tend to find solutions? Didn't you hear about that? But I'm pretty sure that you did. That is why they keep lying to Moldovan citizens, saying that it is all Moscow's fault. Why don't they say that many cases took place in Western countries when they find out that behind all that, the Kiev-sponsored criminals stand. The so-called Russian threat is used also to justify the rampant militarization of the Republic. The harmonization of the Moldovan army to NATO military structures and pumping with Western weaponry. On the 17th of June, another ceremony of transfer to the Minister of Defense of Moldova, another lot of Western military aid, namely armored vehicles Piranha 5. According to Moldovan Minister of Defense, Anatoly Nesat, this means another stage of modernization of the Moldovan army and strengthening of its operational capacities. And this brings about another question. Where do Moldovan authorities intend to use these operational capacities? Apart from armored vehicles, the Republic receives other types of weaponry. After numerous comments in mass media on military exercises with drones, the authorities can no longer sweep it under the carpet. In the beginning of June, the president of the country, Maria Zakharova, announced the idea to produce drones in the country. Another Minister of Economic Development and Digitalization of the Republic, Mr. Osmanescu, admitted that the process of amendment in the legislation to deploy military drone production in the country was launched. Against this backdrop, EU countries plan to double military spending to Moldova. In May, the head of the so-called EU diplomacy, Kaja Kallas, announced the allocation of another 120 million euros to the so-called European Fund of Peace to strengthen the anti-missile system of Moldova. All this is given as grant aid, but we know that this free cheese received from the West has never been for free. And at the end of the day, Moldovan citizens will have to pay for that, not with money, but very often with their lives, as it is the case in Ukraine. Recently, the Moldovan Minister of Defense initiated the organization of compulsory military training for men who previously didn't serve in the army. This introduction will cover all male citizens aged between 27 and 55. 6-week compulsory training course will be organized for them to acquire the necessary military skills, and the document has already been handed over to the parliaments, and the voice of the citizens is not heard at all. Despite the neutrality enshrined in the Constitution of Moldova, the leadership keeps dragging the country into the militarist ventures, transforming to another anti-Russian platform. They are ready to do anything for the sake of joining the so-called European family. But I think that we are all aware of these so-called European values and the alien traditional values to traditional Moldova society have been imposed by the Maia Sandu team. On the 21st of June, the Moldovan capital held another LGBT parade.
Despite the fact that such celebrations were banned by the municipal authorities of Chisinau, but yet the ruling elites, with the support of Western embassies, have pushed through this application to organize this march of various genders across the central streets of Chisinau. And this march has culminated into the improvised wedding of 2 homosexuals. Luckily, same-sex marriage is not a new norm in the Moldovan society, and that they are not recognized by Moldovan law, and they are not accepted by society and the church. According to Social Pulse, 85% of Moldovans oppose the legalization of same-sex marriage, and the Orthodox Church of Moldova has been working since 2022 to ban LGBT festivals in Moldova. It's quite interesting that on June 20th, just prior to this LGBT march, sensible political and public figures of Moldova have organized a March of Family in support of traditional values. It brought together more than 3,500 participants, while the adherents of the neoliberal agenda managed to rally at least 300 persons. Yes, people are different, they have different life situations, but this ideologies are being imposed on them by other states. These ideas are being imposed to a sovereign country, and they're trying to explain it's their new tradition, new norm, and new ethic, which is unacceptable. The recent social polls demonstrate that the sensible Moldovan citizens still hold the majority, but yet their opinions are being blatantly disregarded. 53 to 58% of Moldovans do not believe in pro-Western propaganda and believe that Moldova is going in the wrong direction. But who's going to listen to their opinion? Speaking about other regions, but problems are caused by similar factors. In June, the naval and air forces of the Republic of Korea, together with the armed forces of the United States, have organized military exercises in the waters of the Sea of Japan and Yellow Sea in the close vicinity of the maritime border of the DPRK, and they have organized firing practice with the use of missiles, and we strongly believe that this act was directed against the DPRK, and it raises concern in the context of the further developments of the situation in the Korean Peninsula, and it seems that the South Korean authorities, who continue to declare their desire to diffuse tensions in the region, but yet they are doing the contrary. It is obvious that South Korea and Washington are still guided by confrontational bloc approaches, and they do not want to create terms for political and diplomatic settlement of the existing problems, but yet they want to exacerbate them by putting increased pressure on North Korea. Following such policies fraught with serious consequences for regional security, we are convinced that the lasting peace and stability in Northeast Asia requires objective assessment of the geopolitical realities in the Korean Peninsula, as well as the consideration of concerns in the field of security for all countries involved, including DPRK. We have paid our attention to the report by Secretary General on children and armed conflict. The Russian Minister of Foreign Affairs has been speaking a lot about the plight of children affected by armed conflict, and the children suffering from the deliberate terrorist, large-scale arbitrary action of the Office of the President. Their actions are being reflected in the strategic documents of Ukraine. We have been always providing information about the victims, their age, their names, names of their family members. We are talking about the wounds that they suffer every time, what assistance they received, and how those who provide assistance to them are being attacked. And do you think this information is reflected in the report? The real information with the geographical location, names, and ages, do you think any of that was reflected in the report like they did with the incident in Bucha? Well, of course not. We noted that the report of the United Nations Secretary General on Children and Armed Conflict in 2025, we strongly condemn this political move of Antonio Guterres to keep our country listed in the annex on parties that commit grave violations affecting children in the context of the situation of Ukraine. After the college and dormitory was attacked in Starobelsk, after the passenger bus was attacked, after everything that happened over the years, Alley of Angels in Donetsk, a generation of children affected by Lepestok mines. And after all that, Antonio Guterres wasn't brave, intelligent, reasonable, conscious, I know what even to say, humane, to write anything, to write something about it, but yet he continues to accuse Russia. We believe that it's a politically motivated step that is not evidence-based, and we regret that UN Secretariat continues to use unverified information that they receive from biased sources, and it ignores Russian assessments and materials that we have been providing all this time. We are confused by the fact that the armed forces of Ukraine are not listed in the annex. The crimes committed against children, crimes committed by the representatives of the Kiev regime, including attacks on civil infrastructure, educational facilities, residential quarters, are not reflected in the report in the appropriate and impartial way. The Special Representative of Secretary General on Children and Armed Conflict, Vanessa Frazier, could have seen all of that for herself when she visited Russia. So we have a question for Mr. Guterres. I think that your colleague, the special representative, has provided all the materials after her visit to Russia. I would like to stress that the Russian Federation strongly adheres to the norms of international humanitarian law and ensures protection of civilians, including in the area where the special military operation is conducted. We call the UN Secretary General to abandon the politicization of such sensitive issue and strictly adhere to the principles of impartiality, objectiveness, and neutrality, and we kindly ask Guterres to revoke this decision, to list Russia in the annex, and to work meticulously on the report and to work professionally on this report. Another topic, which is also related to the United Nations, the Committee on Space that was organized in Vienna was characterized by the intensified, principled confrontation between the collective West, led by the United States, who seek to assert their dominance in outer space, and countries of the global South, who are interested in developing fair and non-discriminatory rules and governing the whole spectrum of dynamically developing areas of outer space activity. Austrian authorities have made a provocative stunt. They refused a visa for a head of the Russian delegation, a special representative of the Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs and International Cooperation in the outer space research and use of outer space for peaceful purposes, Sergei Belauska. They also has denied a visa for Sergei Krikalev, who is a hero of the Soviet Union, hero of the Russian Federation, and Deputy Director General of the state corporation Roscosmos. But regardless of all these obstacles, Russian delegation will continue to promote its national priorities. For example, we will draw attention of the committee to an extremely dangerous trend when the United States and their allies are using satellite constellations and the relevant ground infrastructure that are registered as civilian use systems, which are actually used in support of military activities of foreign armed forces and for interference in domestic affairs of sovereign states. We have to state that as a result of the unprecedented politicization, the Italian chairship in the UN Committee failed to perform its duties. It failed to overcome turbulence and to ensure substantive outcomes of the session. Among these outcomes, there could be recommendations and decisions to establish a permanent advisory mechanism on the moon, establishment under the aegis of the United Nations of an international platform on the exchange of information of outer space objects and developments, the adoption of a list of guidelines on the development of outer space resources, orbital activity, and space debris, and they also they also were supposed to adopt comprehensive measures on the reform of the committee and its subcommittees to adapt it to new realities, including its liquidity crisis. But yet, the committee failed to do all of that. For the first time since its establishment, the committee session was complete without an outcome report, which was blocked by the United States. We are convinced that there is quite a difficult situation being unfolded around the committee, which is connected with the attempts of certain states to undermine the fundamentals of the sustainable functioning of this unique specialized body of the United Nations that is responsible for the promotion of international cooperation for the outer space research and use of peaceful purposes. But we continue to take efforts to prevent such a situation. We are continuing the work to disclose the information about the crimes committed by Japanese militarism. These crimes have no statute of limitations and procedural action continues. The Russian Prosecutor General's office has officially notified in May and in June on making a decision that cancels earlier made decisions to exonerate 40 Japanese nationals, and the decision will be published on the website of the Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs. These individuals were involved in the subversive and espionage activities against the Soviet Union. These persons cannot be exonerated, and their guilt has been proven. Given the course of Japan for remilitarization and revision of its pacifist provisions of its constitution, Japan makes statements that during the Great Patriotic War, Japan has performed its duties in good faith under the USSR-Japan Treaty on Mutual Neutrality that was signed in Moscow on April 13, 1941. I would like to recall that some of these individuals mentioned in the list have been carrying out subversive and espionage activities against the Soviet Union when this treaty was in force. The neutrality was ensured not only through diplomatic agreements, but with a strong military group that the Soviet Union had to deploy in the Far East throughout the entire period of the Great Patriotic War. On November 19, 1942, when the Soviet counteroffensive began near Stalingrad, near the far eastern borders of the Soviet Union to contain the Japanese trade, we have deployed a special group of the Red Army with the size of 1.3 million people. They had 12,000 guns and mortars, 2,500 tanks.
Думаю, не надо обладать высшим военным образованием, чтобы понять, что если бы Советский Союз имел возможность использовать все эти силы и средства на фронте против фашистской Германии, а не держать их на Дальнем Востоке, потери, понесенные нашей страной в ходе войны, были бы намного меньше. Поэтому работа по раскрытию и обнародованию преступлений милитаристской Японии
who are losing their sources of making money, but champions of democracy and human rights are not interested in that, because all of these principles and values are on paper, are in reports. They're just doing that for their inclusivity, as they say.
But in real life, in order to implement at least 1 inch of all those statements, they need to do something, but they claim to not have heard about it. I believe that we can forget about any reflections about freedom, which are so pathetically discussed by executives of the American IT corporations from their perspective. But when next time you hear these corporation CEOs keep saying about them being champions of the freedom of speech, diversity, that they love pushing forward, immediately tell them and ask them, what about those thousands of millions of people who you try to deprive of the service, of the platform, of non-discriminatory communication tool, not about something which would push irrespect. No, we are talking about the platform which is a platform of mutual respect. That is what we kept stressing. Yes, this is yet another act of politicized censorship. But let me recall that in March, Russian users have already been deprived of the opportunity to pay through the App Store. Further on, the National Messenger Max were deleted from the store. So this is not about real claims. No real problem exists. This is a true cleansing of information and communication space. What about Apple? What explanation does it give to such repercussions? Well, sanctions again. This sounds ridiculous. Are you really talking about those sanctions, illegitimate, unilateral, those which have not been recognized by the international law? But here, a small, delicate issue. VK company and its services have never been under sanctions and have never been included into sanctions lists. So even this explanation, which cannot be validated, even it doesn't work here. This is an act of dedicated digital cleansing from unfavorable and apparently too sovereign competitors. This means that this platform has truly become extremely popular and successful. This is yet another proof that in today's world of neoliberal stances, new rules are being concocted down the road, and censorship takes various faces and knows no borders. It is masked under the pretext of the fight against disinformation. It is shielded by the laws of various jurisdictions. They refer to some rules of sanctions implementation. And this brings another question. What about other corporations that operate in our country? Do you really abide by the Russian law? Have you opened your mission here in order to find solution in the mutual respect environment underpinned by the Russian legislation? No, the answer is the contrary. So don't you even dare refer into these rules. If one day you hear American corporations being able to give explanations to their illegal acts referring to some laws or articles, remember, this is all hypocrisy. Since last year, basically since the first months of the current U.S. administration, we heard at the highest level, first of all, toward the EU, reprimands in discrimination. They claim that Europeans offend American digital companies. They open criminal investigations against its owners. They didn't like that. The U.S. kept labeling European countries as violators of their obligations in the area of free access to information. So what has happened now? So at that time, when Europeans tried to manage the arbitrariness of American technological giants, Europe immediately became the area of democratic freedom violations from the American perspective. But now, the platform per se, which just recently blamed the EU for infringing on its freedoms, uses the very same tools that was applied to it in the Russian territory. The American private corporation decided which services are to be used in one country and which companies have the right to be on your device and which do not have this right. This is not up to the users to decide on that. This is the corporation itself takes these decisions and undertakes the appropriate moves. But here is my question: who gave them this right? This is not a purely commercial story. This is about welfare and prosperity of millions of people. On top of that, it has to do with the administration, with the government structure of the United States, because the U.S. considers the part and parcel of its governance the free access to information. But today they decided this way. Tomorrow they might decide differently. They might decide to disconnect anything. There are no international law, no rules for them. There are no guarantees. What does this mean? This is another manifestation of neocolonial policy. But you see its digital dimension. This is something that will happen to those who are going to buy American products. I'm talking about digital products here with AI embedded, and implement them into their logistic chains, into the economy. At a certain point in time, those who will choose American products, AI products, will face the very same situation. Either they will be disconnected and consequently a whole clusters, economic sectors will be blocked, or they will face demands or requirements which are at odds with its national legislation. I believe that all countries of the global majority should bear in mind this example. Under the pretext of political situation or corporate responsibility, users are being segregated on the national line. People are deprived of access to vital services for the only reason that they are of these origins, of these nationalities. Because, for instance, they use platforms produced in this or that country. This represents no legitimate claims. The only thing here is segregation. These actions dispel the myth of the political neutrality of global digital giants, their commitment to the integrated development of democratic principles. This is about dictatorship, as it is. Today, no one should have an illusion that most of Western IT infrastructure is used as a tool of pressure, censorship, and advancement of a certain political agenda. But the only achievement they will get from that is that millions of users will stop using their products. They will move to more open, to more democratic and legitimate platforms. I have no doubt that VK and other online services of domestic production will find an opportunity to be visible, to be uploaded on its users' devices, which is numerous. I have no doubt here. But the question is, that de facto American corporations are hitting themselves.
I just remember how it happened with the US dollars. The US and its structures started to close the opportunity to use dollar as a payment instrument, as well as to use dollar in payment systems. But then they were surprised and even indignant that countries and corporations start using national currencies in their payments and transactions, saying that it's a discrimination against dollar, it's a blow dealt to dollar. But the United States itself banned the use of dollar. Aren't they afraid that the same will happen to American platforms? And we would like to hear that they will face discrimination against their platforms. I hope that they are looking closely and will make all the relevant conclusions. I think that users will start using these platforms, and no one will use these narrow platforms like Epstein Islands. Such steps won't be able to isolate the Russian audience. They're just forgetting their declaration on the freedom of speech, freedom of the internet, and human rights. The Western countries themselves and technological corporations consistently destroy the principles, distort and the principles and that they have proclaimed for universals. By their fruits you will know them, as they say. We continue to consistently stand against the practices of digital discrimination, censorship, and arbitrary restrictions in access to information, as well as the establishment of a just, open, and truly democratic international information environment. I would like to say about the important historical date that the European elites prefer to ignore. 6 years ago, the French President Charles de Gaulle visited the Soviet Union, and the visit took place between June 20th and July 1st, 1966. The French leader visited Moscow, Leningrad, Kiev, Volgograd, Novosibirsk, as well as Baikonur Cosmodrome, and following these negotiations, breakthrough agreements were made in trade, economic, scientific, and technical areas, as well as in the exploration and use of outer space for peaceful purposes. The Intergovernmental Commission started to work on a regular basis, and mutual trade has shown sustained growth, and we have intensified contacts in all fields. Several months later, an agreement was signed on the establishment of direct communication between Kremlin and Elysee Palace, and this joint declaration has laid the principles for the development of bilateral relations and the establishment of a climate of detente between all the countries, in particular in the East and in the West, and that would facilitate rapprochement and accord between us. But today, relations between France and Russia, and as well as the relations between Russia and the European Union, are experiencing a tough crisis. It should be recognized that they're in the state of a cold or even hybrid war that is unleashed by the collective West against our country. The current President Emmanuel Macron holds personal responsibility for the dead end in which the Russia-French relations are, and his team has lost the sense of reality and self-preservation, and they dare to openly speak about preparing a military confrontation with our country. Speaking about the origins of the crisis, it should be recognized that it has become a result of the oblivion as well as refusal of the current French elites from foreign political beliefs and tenets of Charles de Gaulle. It is well known that General has commended and valued his confidential relations with Moscow that were established during the Second World War, and which allowed France ultimately to take a seat among victorious powers and to become a permanent member of the United Nations Security Council. France shows total disregard for its role as a permanent member of the United Nations Security Council. Charles de Gaulle realized that there was no alternative to equal cooperation with our country in consideration of our fundamental interests in the area of security. On June 20th, 1966, during a meeting with General Secretary Leonid Brezhnev, General de Gaulle stated, Russia is in every respect the most powerful power in the region in which it is situated. For France, as de Gaulle said, it is an interlocutor with whom mutual understanding and cooperation have always been entirely natural. This political and human reality, as old as our countries, derives from their history and geography. In truth, no serious contradictions have ever arisen between us, not even during the period of War and Peace, or in the age of Sevastopol, the Crimean War of 1853-1856. Throughout the ages, there have been clearly expressed sympathies between our intellectual, literary, artistic, and scientific elites, as well as between our peoples at large. End of quote. Well, we should remember that what damage the France dealt to our people and how our people have forgiven France for that. His visit to the Soviet Union in 1966 has become a clear confirmation of an independent and pragmatic course pursued by the French leader and his ability to rise above the current ideological and political situation and to prioritize long-term strategic national interests. By seeing Russia as a natural partner of France, Charles de Gaulle highlighted that such the political and human reality that is explained by the common history and geography. This understanding has laid the ground for his well-known concept of Europe from the Atlantic to the Urals as a space for respectful political dialogue based on a balance of interest and mutually beneficial trade and economic cooperation of states with various public systems. And at the farewell lunch at the final day of his visit, he stressed that as for our common goals, they are detente, accord, security, and one fine day, the unification of Europe from one end to the other, balance and peace throughout the world. His ideas are similar to the initiatives put forward by President Putin to establish a greater Eurasian partnership and Eurasian security architecture. These two initiatives are open for all countries and associations of Eurasia, including its Western European regions. We should note that how far has the French diplomacy has moved away from the Gaullist principles. They give credit to the first leader of the Fifth Republic, but yet the current ruling elites of France have abandoned his political legacy long ago. They have joined the ranks of those who do not want to listen anything about the Russian right to have its own interest in the security, and they even seek to inflict strategic defeat in our country. The French general, the leader of the French resistance, and an eminent historical figure for both national and global history, all these legacies being forsaken and forgotten. I will just give you one example that illustrates how Charles de Gaulle's approach is distinct from the methods of the current French authorities. In 1966, when he prepared for his visit to the Soviet Union, he read books on Russian history. He has explored in greater detail his itinerary, as well as he wrote speeches that he wanted to deliver in various cities, partially in the Russian language. We cannot expect such a profound approach from temporary occupiers of the elite.
Они себя так и ведут, бесконечно манипулируя темой взаимодействия с Россией и вообще российской темой. Остается лишь посоветовать этим самым временщикам не забывать пророческие слова своего собственного великого
them on a common panel as a symbol of unity of peoples and common historical memory. On June 26, the International Day Against Drug Abuse and illicit trafficking is observed globally. It was instituted in 1987 by the UN General Assembly Resolution 42/112. You will find more information about it in the text version of the briefing, but I would like to say that this year we will mark 35 years since the establishment of diplomatic ties between Russia and Belize. Today, foreign ministers of our countries have exchanged congratulatory messages. In his message, Sergei Lavrov pointed out that over the years, Russia and Belize managed to lay the solid legal foundation for the comprehensive development of bilateral cooperation, and he has expressed confidence in the need to fully unlock its potential at international venues as part of common efforts to shape a truly multipolar world. In his turn, the Belizean counterpart has reaffirmed the commitment to strengthen Russia-Belize ties in areas of mutual interest to the benefit of both nations, noting that our bilateral cooperation has a positive influence on the development of the entire Caribbean region. Another important date, on June 29th, Republic of Seychelles will celebrate 50 years of its independence. This momentous event in the history of the Seychelles has become a milestone toward the establishment of its statehood, and it has laid the foundation for its progressive development, and we extend our sincere congratulations to the Seychellois with this big celebration, and we wish prosperity and well-being. On June 30th, we will celebrate the 50 years of the establishment of diplomatic relations between our countries. The Seychelles have become an important partner of Russia in Africa. For more than 5 decades, Moscow and Victoria have been maintaining traditionally friendly relations grounded in mutual respect, consideration of interests of one another, principles of sovereignty and non-interference in domestic affairs. In April 2026, President of the Seychelles, Patrick Hermini, visited Moscow, and on April 22nd, he had talks with the Russian President Vladimir Putin. We're also taking efforts to intensify bilateral cooperation in various fields and to create new joint projects. Russia and the Seychelles are committed to increase constructive political dialogue, interparliamentary and interagency exchanges, enhance cooperation in trade, economic, financial, investment, energy, transport, agriculture, and tourism, as well as in education, healthcare, culture, and sports. The two states are united in their commitment to create multiple world order. They respect fundamental, universally recognized principles and norms of international law, and they recognize the central role of the United Nations in world affairs. We have established substantial legal framework. In particular, the Intergovernmental Agreement on the waiver of visa requirements for short-term visits has been effective since 2015, and in April we signed an interagency memorandum of cooperation in culture. Russia provides humanitarian assistance to the Seychelles. In April, Victoria received the Russian humanitarian aid, and also that's quite a popular tourist destination among Russians. Another important information. From June 30th to July 2nd, 2026, Saransk, Republic of Mordovia, will host the 3rd International Conference, the Global Treasury of Mother Tongues to protect and to cherish context policy and the practice of the preservation of indigenous languages. It is organized by the Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the Federal Agency for Ethnic Affairs of Russia, the Russian Committee of the Intergovernmental UNESCO Program Information for Everyone. This conference is organized as part of the International Decade of Indigenous Languages, and the organization of this conference will help Russia to make significant contribution to the organization of the decade and to implement UNESCO's program Information for Everyone. This is the only intergovernmental interdisciplinary program and one of its priorities is the preservation of languages and development of linguistic diversity in the cyberspace. The conference will bring together more than 150 eminent Russian and foreign specialists in linguistic policy, in education, culture, communication, and information, representatives of intergovernmental international organizations, authorities, civil society institutions, and private sector from 30 countries. Among the guests of honor is the leadership of the Federal Agency for Ethnic Affairs, representatives of the Presidential Executive Office, head of the Republic of Moldova, Artyom Zdunov, chair of the 43rd session of the UNESCO General Conference, Kir Mohammed Talha of Bangladesh, and representatives of the Diplomatic Corps. The conference will provide a good platform for discussions of the most relevant issues for the support of multilingualism, including with the use of advanced technologies and AI systems. It will ensure opportunities to exchange advanced experience in the preservation and development of indigenous languages and further strengthening of international cooperation in the field. Among the key topics are languages in digital field, the current situation and prospects for future, linguistic communities and linguistic activists, the use of indigenous languages in education. This event will allow to present an international community experience of Russia as one of the multi-ethnic and multilinguistic countries of the world, which prioritizes the support for languages and cultures of its peoples and preservation of the Russian language as a language of inter-ethnic communication. This topic is particularly relevant in the context of the Year of Unity of Peoples of the Russian Federation. The solemn opening ceremony will be held on July 1st in the State Russian Drama Theatre. We invite media representatives to visit the event. You will find all the details on the program accreditation and other details in the text version of the briefing.
In addition, I would like to say, echoing the linguistic and cultural diversity preservation, over the last years, the ethnic dossier is being politicized. It is a subject of double standards, and all in all, it is designed to fuel confrontation and balkanization, unlike gathering in the international community. We see examples of that, and we keep pointing at them. One cannot use the above-mentioned areas, if I may put it this way, about culture, to dismantle or to destroy. Culture is meant to unite. And unfortunately, the US, Canada, and other unfriendly countries are extremely active. They use all multilateral platforms and mass media to disseminate falseful and unverified information about alleged violations of linguistic and ethnic minority rights in our country. For us, as for most representative of the international community, it is obvious that if you hear accusations from the West, they are trying to deviate global attention from their domestic problems exactly in that area. The Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Russian Federation prepared the second report on the situation with ethnic minorities in various countries, as it was the case of the 2024 report. Relevant issues are identified, and the current state of indigenous people situation is presented in Denmark, Norway, Canada, Sweden, Australia, New Zealand, and Japan. You will find references to the report, its English version, in the text of today's briefing. Almost all countries that I just mentioned had the assimilation discrimination policy in place, and consequently it engendered a number of political, social, economic, and cultural challenges. These negative trends are extremely acute in the Arctic region. This is different from what we carry out in our country, from the policies that we conduct in our country. By the presidential decree of the 2026 year, this year was declared the year of people's unity. We covered all the activities designed to strengthen inter-ethnic respect, unity and diversity in our briefings, as well as recognition and support of various peoples residing in our territory. Washington and the West, who joined it, should perhaps apprehend or maybe recognize that in this area the mentorship that they use in regard to our country is out of place. On the contrary, that should learn from our experience how to find solutions to challenges that they create, and as well as to preserve culture and languages of the peoples that live in the territory of a country. At least our country does not have those shameful pages in its history as camps for children, as it was the case in Canada. This machine of so-called culturization and civilizationing hosted thousands of people. Over 6,000 simply died of sexual harassment and hunger, anti-sanitary conditions, and the survivors had their lives traumatized. You will find references to it in the text of today's briefing, though we already talked about it. The survivors told stories about those who were burned in kilns, those who had to bury the other children. But it is not about the Third Reich. These are the stories of the contemporary Canada. Canada likes portraying itself as a champion of human rights and democracy, despite what happened in its history. You remember the applause given to the Nazi Gunka in the Canadian Parliament. As for the relationship built with the indigenous people practice in the US, I could give you a lecture, a separate lecture. There are lots of books and works dedicated to that topic. I believe you are all well aware of that in the terms like reservation and others, which are widely used in literature and in mass culture related to those countries. That is why Washington and Ottawa should focus on domestic problems. You are welcome to familiarize yourself with our report. Perhaps they could handle psychological, linguistic and cultural challenges which were the product of forced assimilation and physical elimination of indigenous peoples. Once again, I invite you to read our report. Another important information is that Russian Minister of Foreign Affairs, together with the Moscow Conservatory of Tchaikovsky, with the support of the Russian World Foundation since 2023, has organized an international musical project called Emerging Stars. It is meant to show the image of Russia as a country with the richest cultural and artistic legacy. Students, conservatory graduates and laureates of prestigious international competitions take part in various concerts and workshops around the globe. The geography is expanding. Recently, concerts were held in Latin America, Chile, Nicaragua, Guatemala, Mexico. This year, participants of the project already performed in Asia, namely Thailand, Mongolia, Malaysia. They also visited Africa, Benin, Nigeria, Angola. They held concerts and workshops in the CIS countries, including Armenia, Kazakhstan, Tajikistan. By the end of 2026, they plan to come to the Middle East. The initiative is ambitious and is designed to resonate in the global community. Such cultural visits raise awareness about Russian music education. Students are willing to study here, and in this sense, the Moscow Conservatory is an unprecedented, unique place where the Center Musical Cultures of the World was established. It organizes international festivals, including the Universe of Sound and Gathering Friends. An intense exchange of students and mentors is organized. such musical tools show the experience and the potential, the openness and the diversity and the might of the Russian culture. The program is meant to raise awareness about the Russian artistic legacy, namely the works of the Russian composers, writers, the enthusiasm and the professionalism of Russian performers does not leave anyone indifferent. I believe that musicians come back from such tours filled with emotions. They are guided by curiosity. They want to push the borders of their inner world even further. They want to listen to and learn something new. So to my mind, the project is fantastic. It is about interaction between cultures and people-to-people communication. This is the diplomacy which unites representatives of various ethnicities, young musicians, through their will to listen to each other. The new exhibition will be opened in Tokyo. It is dedicated to Joseph Goshkevich. He used to be the Russian representative in Japan. It goes in line with the joint decision by the joint board of the Russian Minister of Foreign Affairs and Minister of Belarus. Goshkevich, who was an expert in Eastern studies, contributed to the emergence and development of the Russian-Japanese relationship. The center of the historic memory is the city of Hakodate in Hokkaido. There, in 1858, the first Russian consulate was inaugurated. In 1989, the first monument to Goshkevich was erected. This is a bronze bust by the Soviet sculptor Oleg Komov. Today, despite the unfriendly posture of the official Tokyo locals and civil society organizations, still cherish the positive legacy of our shared history, that of Russia, Belarus, and Japan. You see the difference between the official authorities and attitude and the attitude by locals. We hope that the exhibition, where representatives of political, economic, and scientific circles are invited to come, will contribute a lot to the unbiased understanding of the events of the past. It will also lay the grounds for strengthening dialogue with those who are committed to a constructive dialogue with our country. I am convinced that, of course, it will be interesting for the big public and the researchers. The International Affairs, are you with us? I'm ready to take your questions. You published the article of Sergei Lavrov talking about the European security architecture. You have the floor. Thank you very much. Here is my question. On one hand, it seems to be simple. On the other hand, of course, it is more sophisticated. So I'd like to hear your comment on the recent decision by the chamber of the Romanian parliament about the reunification of Romania and Moldova. It is no secret that Bucharest wants to merge, to acquire Moldova. Now we see it in practice. Romanian political circus for long years have been interfering into the domestic internal affairs of a sovereign neighboring state. For some reason, the appropriate circles of Romania find themselves in right to decide on the future of neighboring states. Both states are involved. It is noteworthy that even Romanian establishment is heterogeneous on this matter. A testimony to this is the results of the votes on the draft about unification. But what kind of unification are you talking about? Perhaps it is better to ask own citizens about whether they want it. But when we are talking about, let's say, merger and acquisition in states, that's a different story. Legal committee already gave its negative assessment, and recently the chamber endorsed this draft without discussing the draft as it is provided by the Constitution, owing to the end of the time for discussion. So you see where the democracy is. Even not only residents are not asked, but even lawmakers are not involved. Well, the future of this draft depends on the comment of representatives of the high legislative body of Romania. But once again, the sentiment of Moldovans is ignored. It would be a good idea to ask them whether they want to join. Even elderly generations still remember the occupation of Bessarabia, without mentioning the fact that this move is unlikely to push from a stalemate the situation in Transnistria. I don't want to be a lawyer here, but metaphorically, that is how the annexation looks like. As long as annexation is the word constantly used by the officials in Brussels, the European Parliament, without any legal grounds when they speak about our country, let me here remind you that all the decisions about reunification in our country were backed by the expression of the will of the residents. It was organized in line with the legislation and under the international observation. So, if they decide to use this term of annexation, why don't they apply it to the situation which is directly linked to this term? Thank you. Izviestia, are you with us? Good afternoon, Izviestia. How would you comment the joint statement by the heads of the Republic of Korea and the EU adopted after the summit on June 10th, which focused on the support of the Kiev regime and condensed Russian and DPRK cooperation? You know, we see no need to respond to another attack by our opponents designed to discredit Russia, which acts in line with the UN Charter, international law, when it comes to bilateral cooperation with DPRK. We regret that the leadership of the Republic of Korea was not courageous enough to isolate itself from the attacks on Moscow and Pyongyang, despite the fact that they are at odds with the policy of the Republic of Korea, and this could only intensify the escalation in the Korean Peninsula. Interfax, are you with us? Thank you. Here we are. Good afternoon. Here is our question. What is Moscow's assessment on the implementation of the Iran-US MOU signed last week? Does Moscow see risks of another escalation due to Iran's principled stance on the Strait of Hormuz and Israeli activities on the south of Lebanon? Recently, we commented on that. I will give you a quote from yesterday's speech by Minister Lavrov at the Primakov readings. He said the following: "We hope that the renewed free shipping across the Strait of Hormuz will contribute to the energy and food security of the global South countries, and stabilization of the military and political situation in the Gulf area will be a pretext to launch large dialogue on the new security and cooperation architecture." Thank you very much. Is Sputnik with us? Here we are. Good afternoon. If you allow, I will ask two questions. First, the former U.S. National Intelligence head Tulsi Gabbard disclosed information about 40 biological laboratories funded by the U.S., and these data corresponds to what back in 2022 was indicated by Russia, including the killed General Igor Karylov. He was killed by Ukrainian terrorists. But at that time, politicians in the West ignored this. How do you think will it contribute to a shift in the international investigation? You know, we talked in detail about this last time at our briefing. I can only repeat that we hope that American authorities will complete their investigation in regard to financing biological research outside the national territory, and will finally dare disclose all the existing facts. We also hope that concrete moves will follow. In particular, conclusions will be made about preventing the situation when one state finances biological programs with the military component in the territory of another state, sometimes putting at risk the health of the civilian population, and of course influence at the adjacent states. In this regard, we keep convincing foreign partners around the globe that there is a need to ensure national sovereignty in terms of control over biological research. And here's my second question. The military conflict in the Middle East undermined the signing of Russian-Iranian documents on the implementation of the North-South corridor. How quickly is Moscow ready to defreeze the allocated loans and come back to signing of the agreements, in particular on the construction of the railroad Resht-Astar? You know, the credit line for financing the project has not been frozen. We expect the signing of the executive contract and a solution for technical issues to launch as soon as possible practical works on the platform. Of course, we see that Iranian partners are more interested in the development of the international transport corridor north-south, which amid the unstable situation in the area of the Strait of Hormuz gains even more relevance in order to ensure bilateral trade and sustained shipments to Iran. Neighboring countries are also interested in this project.
Thank you. Xinhua, please. Hello, Ms. Zakharova. Today we have the following question. The 9th China-Eurasia Expo will be organized between June 25th and 29th in Urumqi in Xinjiang. It is well known that this time Russia will represent its pavilion at this exhibition. Could you please tell us more about the participation of Russia in this event, and what are the key areas will be highlighted? And in your opinion, how this expo is going to enhance Russia-China cooperation and exchanges? In your opinion, what is the current level of trade and economic relations and humanitarian contacts between Russia and China? Thank you. We support the organization of events in China that aim to develop multilateral trade and economic cooperation and to enhance Russia-China business ties. We welcome the participation of Russian business community in it, and we hope that the 9th China-Eurasia Expo will provide opportunities for Russian and Chinese businessmen to learn more information about each other and to expand their cooperation. We also invite Chinese partners to attend the major exhibition events in Russia. Russia is going to hold the Eastern Economic Forum from September 1st to 4th in Vladivostok, Russian Energy Week, October 14th to 16th in Moscow, INAPROM in Yekaterinburg from July 6th to 9th. The forum sprouts August 16th to 19th in Kazan, and other events that cause increased interest of Chinese participants. We hope that intensive exchanges, especially between our business communities, plays a crucial role in the successful promotion of the whole range of Russia-China practical cooperation that demonstrates high adaptiveness and resilience despite external challenges and pressure. I recall that 30 years ago, we have established strategic partnership between our countries, and 25 years ago, Russia and China have signed a treaty on good neighborliness, friendship, and cooperation. And with that treaty, we were able to upgrade the Russia-China cooperation and to elevate it to an unprecedentedly high level. One of the decisions of heads of two states during the official visit of President Putin to China was the agreement to extend the effect of the big treaty for another 5-year period. As for our trade and economic and humanitarian ties, they are on the rise. The bilateral trade is growing for several years in a row, and it has exceeded the figure of $200 billion. We have also signed an agreement on promotion and protection of investments. Our leaders have decided to announced the years 2026-2027 as years of education, which is the 10th interstate thematic project. And I would like to say that our bilateral cooperation in education is developing actively. We are increasing academic mobility, expand cooperation between our universities. There are contacts between our universities and colleges. We are successfully implementing our flagship projects with the joint Russia-China University in Shenzhen, which is opened at the premises of the Russian Moscow State University and Beijing Polytechnical Institute. One of the main tasks today is to create necessary conditions so that young citizens of our countries would be able to develop their careers and to become professionals. Thank you. Reuter, please. Hello, Ms. Zakharova. We have a question about the supplies, Western supplies to Ukraine. On Tuesday, June 23rd, Russia announced that 5 Storm Shadow missiles produced by Great Britain were intercepted. At the same time, a number of mass media and military bloggers informed that Ukraine used Storm Shadow or American ERA missiles to attack Voronezh on June 22nd, which claimed lives of 5 persons. The Deputy Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov explained in April that Russia demands from Washington to stop supplying weapons to Ukraine, although these demands were left without an answer. Do you maintain contacts with Washington? Were there any requests? Did you make the similar requests to London? And does Moscow intend to stop the supplies of Western weapons to Ukraine with the diplomatic methods, or are there any other options in your arsenal? We believe that the use of high-tech Western weapons, including British and French cruise missiles of long-range, Storm Shadow and Scalp, is impossible without the direct participation of foreign specialists that ensure their operation and targeting, as well as without providing the necessary intelligence data to the armed forces of Ukraine. We publicly warned the key Western sponsors of Zelensky regime, including
прямой ответственности за эскалацию, за затягивание боевых действий на Украине, что вкупе с буквально отмашкой на удары вглубь российской территории.
Compared to the American side, our ministry continues to take vigorous efforts to return 6 objects of the Russian state property in the United States, and despite their diplomatic status that guarantees its immunity, this property was seized by American authorities in 2016 and 2018 in violation of international and legal commitments of Washington. I recall that we are talking about our property in states Maryland and New York, trade mission in Washington, 2 buildings of the Consulate General in San Francisco, as well as the residence of the Consul General of Russia in Seattle. We repeatedly raised this question in our contacts with the American side at various levels as part of our confiscation, legal takeover. I think it depends on the assessment that is made of that situation. We have a dialogue on a number of irritating factors in our bilateral relations, and we presented as a condition, and only one condition, that will help to restore trust and normalize interstate cooperation. Americans have received proposals to address the situation and to normalize relationship between our countries. However, the State Department doesn't show the proper interest to that topic, but we will continue to our work to return this property. China Media Network. Our Communist Party is celebrating an anniversary. What role the Communist Party is playing in this historical process? What is the main factor that has ensured its resilience and ability to lead the country forward? Yes, we would like to congratulate our Chinese friends on this important date, which is 105th anniversary of the establishment of the Communist Party of China, that continues its historical mission and ensures the comprehensive and progressive development of China. Under its leadership, China has made impressive achievements in economy, social science, and technology, and it has strengthened its international positions, and the party has more than 100 million members. Our country has provided all the assistance to the Chinese people and to the Communist Party of China in the difficult times of revolution and liberation fight, and when new China was established, and contacts between our parties provide a strong contribution to the Russia-China comprehensive partnership and strategic cooperation. In a new era, the leading political forces of Russia continue to work together with the Communist Party of China. We have pursuing a coordinated work between our parties, which makes a significant contribution to the comprehensive development of the whole range of bilateral cooperation. Thank you. About news, please. Hello, Ms. Zakharova. Vilnius started talking about the failed sanctions policy. That assessment was made by the potential Prime Minister. Is it pre-election rhetoric? I recall that Lithuania has blocked the transit through Klaipėda. At the same time, the Lithuanian economy has suffered from this decision, and the Russian and Belarusian logistics have found another alternative. I recall that Lithuania is one of the proponents of imposing various restrictive measures against Russia, continues to pursue destructive policy to sever trade and economic relations. Any public rhetoric on the failure of the sanctions pressure in our country is used by Lithuanian politicians as a point to further intensify anti-Russian restrictions. And as for the second part of your question, I would like to say that Russia has its own logistics infrastructure on the coast of the Baltic Sea. Thank you. Rudolph, please.
Maria Zakharova.
Здравствуйте.
My first question is that regarding the memorandum of understanding between the US and Iran, how confident Russia is that this will lead to an end to the war and an agreement? Also, do you believe that Israeli attacks on Lebanon and some other announcements by US officials would lead to jeopardizing the momentum and fail the process?
Вы знаете, достижение
You know, the achievement of an ultimate agreement between the US and Iran is envisaged by paragraph 3 of the Memorandum of Mutual Understanding that was signed on June 17th by presidents of the two countries, and it was signed online. Well, it requires 60 days to develop it, and this deadline might be extended on mutual consent, and the paragraph 14 of this memorandum envisages the approval of the document by the resolution of the United Nations Security Council, which is compulsory for the implementation by all member states of the United Nations. When the US and Iran will reach final agreements, we will be ready to, in the most constructive way, to participate in the process and the agreement of the relevant draft resolution of the United Nations Security Council.
What will this support from Russia include to prevent any other possibility for a new war to start between those two countries?
мне кажется, частично.
I think that I have already provided an answer to that question partially, answering your first question. Talking about the resolution that should be taken by the United Nations Security Council to prevent the outbreak of war of US and Israel against Iran, I think a lot depends on the content as well as on the will of the member states to fulfill their obligations that are related to the implementation of the decisions taken by the United Nations Security Council, as well as norms of international law. Minsk agreements have become part of the resolution of the United Nations Security Council, but yet these Minsk agreements were not realized. Moscow believes that we needed to build a rapid architecture of security in the Persian Gulf, and we have explained to partners and friends in the region an updated Russian concept that provides a framework for a trusted dialogue based on the consideration of interests of each country.
Great. My last question is that how's your cooperation in 2026 compared to 2027 with Syria, especially in economic way? Has it been increasing or decreasing, or could you give us something about it?
Вы знаете, мы комментировали неоднократно.
You know, we repeatedly commented on the Russia-Syria relationship at the current stage, namely during the briefing of the 10th of June. Let me repeat that we keep extending the multifaceted cooperation between our states. Both entrepreneurship and state agency are involved. The Permanent Russian-Syrian Commission on the Economic, Trade, Scientific and Technical Cooperation is working, so we are committed to advancing it even more.
Спасибо вам. С нами ли? Спасибо взаимно. С нами ли Лен?
Thank you. Lenta Ru, are you with us? Good afternoon. We have only one question, if you may. As you noted today, Ukraine is undertaking attempts to glorify Nazi collaborators. And for this reason, its relationship with Poland has significantly degraded. Do you think what this could lead to, and do you see any prospects or the need to restore dialogue with Poland on the topic of the memory on the Great Patriotic War? You know, actually, we are witnessing a number of public statements and moves by the Polish officials blaming the Kiev regime policy, who openly glorify Bandera, henchman of Nazi, including the episode with revocation of Zelensky of the highest grade of Poland. We should not forget about revival of Nazism in Ukraine, and this goes back to the Nazism of the 1930s. It was made at connivance of the Western sponsors, and all in all, it has a contemporary dimension as well. I mean, expelling everything related to the Russian identity, not only in the territory of Ukraine. That is why, starting from the coup d'etat in 2014, Polish officials kept singing praises to the Ukrainian politicians who were involved in glorifying Hitlerian lapdogs of the UPA, who believe that the Polish people will evaluate the actions by the political class who, seeking to harm Russia, nourished the hotbed of Bandera ideology. You know, given that it stopped being a purely domestic policy, this is a global challenge. I'm talking about Nazism, which is being nourished and glorified in Ukraine. It has gained a global dimension. Of course, every state has to decide on which awards to issue to whom. Of course, it was an imperative. It was always the case. But as long as the highest national award is given to someone who, as we speak, is destroying Russian-speaking citizens, those who relate their lives to Russia, I have something to add. Perhaps the Polish officials would award it to those Polish citizens who truly act for the prosperity of the country. I mean, those who are involved in maintaining the historic memory, who want to maintain the memorials erected to brotherly warriors in Warsaw. For instance, Iżytica could get this award, this highest order, because he paid the price of his life protecting monuments. And this is true given what is happening to him in Poland. He protected the memorials and monuments erected to those who secured the survival of Poland. But frankly speaking, I have doubts on that, not because, unfortunately, the present Warsaw has been intoxicated by this interest to harm Russia by hook or by crook. I have doubts on whether anti-fascists would accept this award, the award which has been given to Zelensky. And a few decades ago, the same award was given to Goering Nazi. Currently, Zelensky, the neo-Nazi Zelensky, had this award revoked. But what about this award given to Goering? I'm really interested to know what the situation was. I didn't find any information, any facts proving that Goering and Mussolini had their awards revoked. Maybe there is at least a single letter. Once again, I'm really excited to know that. Russia rejects any attempts to rehabilitate Nazism. Our stance is well known. OU and UPA have tarnished their reputation by the inhumane crimes committed against Soviet and Polish citizens of various ethnicities, Polish, Russian, Belarusian, Jews, and even Ukrainians themselves who did not share inhumane ideologies of Bandera. In a civilized society, there is no place and could be no place to successors of Ukrainian collaborators of Hitler. As for the renewed historical dialogue with Warsaw, the question itself for us is hypothetical today. Why? Over the last decades, many efforts have been applied, including those of joint manuals on history. A lot has been done in order to leave this page in the past, but at the same time not to forget it and to allow future generations to live in peace and accord. But everything was crushed by the Polish officials. They have been intoxicated by these Russophobic sentiments. The Polish authorities conduct hostile policy towards our country. For many years, they have been engaged in falsifying the history, destroying monuments to Soviet warriors, liberators, and to their own Polish warriors. Once again, I repeat that these monuments were erected by Polish citizens. Both Soviet and Polish warriors paid the price of their lives protecting and defending the peace free of fascism and Nazism and the future of Poland as a state and as a people. This state owes to them their statehood. There is no environment to build a dialogue. There is nothing to discuss. Because there is nothing to discuss with those who support blindly the neo-Nazi Kiev regime. Thank you. Newsroom, are you with us? Good afternoon. We have two questions today. First, Starmer became the 5th British Prime Minister in a row who didn't stay in his position till the end of his mandate. And the UK will have its 7th head of the government within a decade. How does Moscow interpret such political reshuffling? Does it testify to a systemic crisis of the British political model? Does Russia have any expectations given the change in the government of the state? Or does this reshuffling have no impact on Moscow's stance? You know, we gave comments repeatedly on the crises within the British government. At the last briefing, we mentioned it. That is why the statement by Keir Starmer about resigning from the leader of the Labour Party and the position of a Prime Minister came as no surprise. Because that is how the UK political machine works. We do not expect any progress in our bilateral relationship. Let me recall that we were ready to build a dialogue, to restore a dialogue with the UK destroyed by London initiative once our opponents stop their confrontational course, reject aggressive support of the neo-Nazi Kiev regime, sanctions policy, hysteric intimidation of their own population of the non-existent Russian threat. The problem is that the present hostile stance taken by the UK is underpinned by the anti-Russian ruling establishment, which rests on the multi-century tradition of Russophobic sentiment in the London policy. Whoever comes to replace Mr. Starmer, it will be a representative of the same party and political circles nourished within the liberal and globalist Atlantist ideological matrix and representing interests of military and industrial cooperation and financial elite of the city who get their hand on the anti-Russian confrontation. It is highly unlikely that the next Prime Minister will be able to overcome the situation, to rectify it, to overcome the external and domestic destructive forces. Otherwise, of course, we will be ready to welcome him. Analyzing the specific moves undertaken by the UK, we will be happy to see a new occupant of Downing Street to manifest wisdom, courage, and internal power, then we will be able to start from scratch. If he rejects the aggressive narrative, the attempts to find an enemy where there is none, and to throw in money for the confrontation, it would serve the interests of London itself. It would also allow for the government to gain trust from their own population. If a prime minister dares and has the courage to make such moves. But it would also contribute to maintaining the fragile peace in Europe. This restoration would help all of us to move away from the precipice that we are approaching, and this becomes vital. Our next question. Zelensky said that Kiev will define who will represent European states at the potential talks with Russia, while the master of the European flies, if I can say so. So at the June summit, the EU did not endorse one candidacy for the role of a broker or negotiator.
Я уже сказала об этом кратко. Позволю перебить вас, потому что кратко сказала, а расширенно и со всеми обоснованиями.
Basically hasn't taken shape yet, but still she wants to be in. They seek to quantitatively and qualitatively to strengthen the position of Kiev and to dictate their conditions to us from the position of force. So the question arises whether these states are still sovereign, or maybe they sold their sovereignty to Zelensky. A recent example is the joint communique by the Euro Troika, namely the UK, France and Germany, which includes a number of ultimatums toward Russia. We saw these Troika in a train car leaving Kiev. A British, a French and a German were sitting in a train car preparing a table with spoons and cups. Maybe that is how they were preparing a document. We do not know how this really happened. So Europe does not hide that it sees itself at the negotiation table not as a constructive broker, but as a representative of the anti-Russian camp within a certain united delegation of the West and Ukraine. So you see, this is a hybrid grouping. It also echoes the statement you mentioned by Zelensky about a certain right of Bankova to choose a negotiator from the EU. Well, surprisingly, that amid multilateral military, financial and other support allocated to the neo-Nazi Kiev regime and encouraged terrorist attacks against civilians, Europeans speculate about a certain role in the Ukrainian settlement. So they have been engaged in terrorist attacks. They cannot be peace brokers. So what Europeans can offer against this backdrop? Now they believe that they pay for this war. That is why they cannot see this war finished without them. This seems to be the sole argument. But here is our response. In other words, they are interested in not losing their investment into the Kiev regime and their own military and industrial complex. So at the end of the day, they do not care about sustained settlement. Anyway, prospects of a dialogue, whoever is a negotiator, will depend on the real willingness of Europeans to respect our legitimate interests. This should find its confirmation in concrete moves. If someone is willing to help, as Russian President Putin put it, we only welcome such initiatives. Thank you very much. Thank you. Dunya News, are you with us?
I'm Shahid Gumman, correspondent Dunya News, Pakistan. I have two questions. My first question is, Pakistan is playing an active and constructive diplomatic role in promoting dialogue and reducing tension in the region. Following the recent Iran-US understanding, what further step does Russia believe are necessary to ensure lasting peace, stability and meaningful dialogue in the Middle East?
Вы знаете, я уже это комментировала, повторю, российско-пакистанские отношения находятся на подъеме, нашими странами поддерживается регулярный политический диалог.
Political dialogue. Our states have traditionally partnered in various areas, including education. We have joint projects in training students as for various complexities, difficulties that Pakistani students might face. I have no information on that, and what I saw does not reflect the real state of affairs. As we know, the number of Pakistani students is constantly growing on an annual basis, and today approximately 1,300 Pakistani students study at our universities. If you have any specific examples, individual examples, of course, we will examine them.
Спасибо вам. Идем дальше. Я, может быть, не расслышала ваш вопрос, может быть, еще.
Perhaps I didn't hear your question.
Iran, US. Student was my second question.
Все, я поняла, да, потому что у меня, я видела
Yes,
ваши вопросы.
I repeat my first question. Pakistan is playing an active and constructive diplomatic role in promoting dialogue and reducing tension in the region. Following the recent Iran-US understanding, what further step does Russia believe are necessary to ensure lasting peace, stability and meaningful dialogue in the Middle East?
Да, я поняла, просто уже.
Yes, I understand your question. This is not the first time I'm answering the question of Pakistani mass media about students. That's why I started to talk about them, because I think that's what concerns you the most. As for the regional issues, Russia gives credit to the vigorous mediatory efforts of Pakistan that seek to de-escalate tensions and to settle differences through negotiations. Islamabad takes a constructive role in that, and we have repeatedly talked about that in our public statements. And in his contacts with foreign partners, Sergei Lavrov mentioned the efforts of Pakistan as well. As of today, it is important for all parties to the conflict to follow Iran-EAS understandings and to prevent escalation, especially in Lebanon. And from the very beginning of the aggression, our country has provided a principled and objective assessment of the situation, which in this position hasn't changed. We are ready to support efforts which aim to ensure the lasting peace and stability in the Middle East. We have provided an updated version of the Russian concept on security in the Persian Gulf, that it includes the unblocking of conflict situations, the principle of divisible and indivisible security, confidence-building measures, freedom of navigation in the Strait of Hormuz based on international law, as well as we hope that this initiative will facilitate the formation of a new post-conflict architecture of interstate relations in this strategically important part of the world, as everyone sees it.
My second question, because you already answered my the second question. Has Russia introduced any new regulations regarding student visas for Pakistani students? According to Pakistani students and education consultants, apart from government scholarship programs, many universities in Moscow are not admitting Pakistani applicants or helping them obtain student visas. If no such regulations have been introduced, what step in the Russian government taking to resolve these difficulties and make it easier for Pakistani students to study in Russia? Thank you very much.
And as for your second question, I will give you more information later. Thank you. So use me, please. Hello, yes, I'm hearing you. So our question is what Moscow thinks about Zelensky's ultimatum, who demand Minsk to dismantle retranslators for Russian UAVs, which are allegedly in Belarus, and he threatened to attack Belarus, and now he believed that they were disconnected, given that Germany started to deploy soldiers on the border with Belarus. Can we believe that the West is following its coordinating plan to drag Belarus into the conflict? Well, that's the militarist and terrorist essence of the Zelensky's regime. They want to drag Belarus into hostilities and to expand geography of combats. That only would complicate opportunities to settle the conflict with political and diplomatic means. This issue was commented by the Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov at the 12th Ambassadorial Roundtable on Ukrainian crisis. The genuine goals and the role of the West. I can only repeat that since March 2025, we have a treaty between Russia and Belarus on security guarantees as part of the Union State, and if there is need, Russia is ready to take an entire complex of measures envisaged by the treaty to ensure the security of our ally as well as the security of the Union State. Посольская жизнь, embassy life, please. Hello, Ms. Zakharova. Hello, dear colleagues. We have one question. Many European countries continue to restrict the work of Russian cultural centers. Does the Russian Minister of Foreign Affairs believe that the cultural diplomacy has fallen prey to the current crisis in international relations? Well, I believe that the cultural diplomacy gets more and more opportunities, but the whole range of countries see culture as civilizational development, as a historical legacy, but as an instrument in implementation of their aggressive ambitions. And so this is a devastating policy that they're pursuing. Thank you. After E, please. Hello, Ms. Zakharova, Ruslan Pankratov. After E, we have 2 questions. Brussels and Washington have been promoting the point that Russia doesn't make a signal what it wants from Europe. Could you provide 3 principled conditions, and if they are realized, it will show that Russia will be ready to gradually normalize relations with EU and NATO for the next 5 or 10 years? Well, that is quite ridiculous. Not your question is ridiculous, but such claims that they are making towards Russia, because on the one hand, they say that they don't understand Russian signals. Russia doesn't send any clear message of what it wants from the EU, but then they block the publication of Sergei Lavrov's article, which would explain the Russian vision of European security, settlement of the crisis in Ukraine, and all other relevant issues of the international agenda. It is similar to the question asked by your colleague about Zelensky's statement with the demand to remove retranslators in Belarus. These are just 2 similar things. Brussels makes ultimatums and sometimes they make ultimatums in situations where it's impossible to listen to them. When a person doesn't want to listen what they're saying, they just close their ears and they start bubbling words loudly so that they wouldn't hear what other person is saying. They use aggressive narratives. They just close their ears. They plug their ears. They don't want their mass media to distribute the Moscow's position. And after that, they're accusing Russia of not sending clear messages. Well, probably at the next briefing, we will formulate again our approach to the issue. And we hope that they will hear you next time. The West is actively promoting the idea of special tribunals on Russian aggression, but at the same time, they ignore their own crimes that they committed in Yugoslavia, Iraq, Libya, Afghanistan. And is the Russian Minister of Foreign Affairs ready to offer an alternative agenda, for example, the creation of the long-term international commission on inquiry of all cases when the UN Charter was circumvented, or when the force is used in circumvention of the United Nations Security Council? This anti-Russian pseudo-tribunal has nothing to do with justice, goals and principles of the United Nations Charter. We have explained at previous briefings and at the statements of the relevant international platforms that such efforts of the EU and Council of Europe are failed, and they are inferior from the legal and political point of views. Western countries or any other country have no right to enter into the exclusive zone of responsibility of the Security Council in violation of the Chapter 7 of the United Nations Charter, and it applies to the use of the force when there is no sanction from the United Nations Security Council, or when it goes beyond the right to self-defense, as well as when it goes beyond the powers to define the act of aggression and the use of the sanctions tool set. we're regularly talking about war crimes and attacks in Yugoslavia, Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, and Syria. All of these attacks were carried out under various slogans for like humanitarian intervention, responsibility to defend, counter war on terrorism, preventive self-defense, etc. All of these military shenanigans were just an act of aggression. In comparison with the collective West, we do not intend to administer international justice and to impose our rules of the game on anyone else. Our rules are governed by the United Nations Charter, and by the way, to develop a single approach of states to its interpretation and implementation of the United Nations Charter, we have established a special committee on the United Nations Charter and on the enhancement of the United Nations role. Russia and Belarus, back in 2014, have put forward a proposal in the special committee to organize an advisory, to request an advisory opinion of the International Court of Justice on the possible legal consequences of the use of force without the authorization of the Security Council, and that goes beyond the right to self-defense. But we have a question for everyone. What do you think, which states have been blocking the implementation of this initiative for so many years? Russian vector, please. Ruski Vector Information Agency, Tatiana Plotnikova. Yes, hello. Mass media have been saying that England is making a lot of troubles for Russia. However, Great Britain has lost its power and it is no longer the Russian rival. We can judge that by the constant changes in prime ministers and their failing fleet and their domestic situation. Do you believe that Russia has only one equal rival, which is the United States? You know, it seems to me that you do not follow our briefings, follow our news. Today, I've been saying that Great Britain is involved in acts of terrorism against our country, in the attacks against our civilians. It cannot be compared with the economic power, with the potential. Great Britain doesn't have economic power, investment potential. As for its achievements in outer space, exploration, technology, they have nothing like that. But yet, they make a lot of troubles to us. Thank you for your attention, and see you next time. Wish you all the best.